Hello and welcome to Skynet Today's Last Week in AI podcast, where you can hear us chat about what's going on with AI. As usual, in this episode, we'll provide summaries and discussion about some of last week's most interesting AI news. You can also check out our Last Week in AI newsletter at lastweekin.ai for articles we did and did not cover in this episode. I'm one of your hosts, Andrei Kurenkov.
And I'm the other one of your hosts, Jeremy Harris. And Andre, this is, I think, one of the first weeks that we've had in the last month or so where it's not all ChatGPT all the time. There's some ChatGPT, but it's not all ChatGPT all the time.
Yeah, we have a bit of variety now. We'll still, maybe it's, I think, a month ago it was like 3/4 ChatGPT. Now it's maybe half.
Yeah, sharing the wealth a little bit here. Yeah,
a little bit. Things are calming down. So finally a bit of variety. But ironically, to start with, in our applications and business section, I just decided to make a LLM or ChatGPT roundup of there's so many of these little stories.
Get it all out of the way.
Just combine all of it. So some of these stories, we got Radio GPT, which is I guess trying to make a radio host with ChatGPT. Well, it's not ChatGPT, it's GPT-3, so it's weird naming. Then there's a story on Salesforce adding ChatGPT to Slack, potentially, and some other things that I got. Microsoft is still integrating ChatGPT to now its developer tools to make it easier to develop applications. Snapchat has launched an AI chatbot powered by GPT technology. It's called My AI, and I'm not sure. I think it's like a chatbot where you can just talk to it and it can answer trivia questions. And it's supposed to have a personality that values friendship, learning, and fun. So yeah, there's just a lot of things. Oh, there's a couple more. We have Duck Assist, which is DuckDuckGo, a search engine, not ChatGPT. It's more of an older, less fancy AI that's just answering some questions. And last up, we have Shortwave email app that introduces AI-powered summaries. Again, not quite as fancy as ChatGPT. It's just if you have a long email, you can summarize it. So yeah, a lot of these announcements, a lot of various places where people are integrating AI, and it just seems like ChatGPT made everyone realize, let's add some AI-powered features because that might be neat.
Yeah, and in a real instance of what sometimes people refer to as technology overhang, where the basic tech, we've talked about this before, but the basic tech behind ChatGPT kind of arguably was somewhat available for the last 3 years. And it just took a lot of, iteration, a lot of fairly small tweaks to the underlying technology to actually make it this explosive. And so, there's a sense in which our AI tools actually have capabilities that we're not seeing just because no one's gotten the right window on them yet. We haven't figured out quite the right way to frame an interaction with these tools to kind of make them as explosively successful. And, maybe this is what'll finally change all that. We're seeing, all these applications, all these companies now experimenting with it. One thing that comes to mind too, looking at the Snapchat thing, I'm old enough to remember when Facebook was new and it was all about, you'd be perusing, it'd be the content that your friends post, all about your friends. It was the social thing. And then over time with newsfeed, gradually it became more and more kind of algorithmic, less and less of your friends' content. And now my Facebook feed, which I'm a little embarrassed to say I still have, my Facebook feed is nothing but these highly entertaining ads. It's kind of what it feels like. And so, it kind of makes you wonder how in Snapchat, are we going to see something like that where right now Snapchat's mostly about human to human interaction. But as these chatbots get better, maybe more and more of the value, that slippery slope kicks in. You start to engage more and more with the AI side of it. And eventually that becomes the product. I don't know, but it's kind of interesting to think about.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think you could say the same about Instagram, where it used to be mostly friends and now it's creators and it's ads, actually very well targeted ads in my experience. And it'll be interesting. I think we have discussed how this AI seems kind of tricky to monetize. It's not cheap to run, and it's like, what are you going to have it talk to you, but then throw in an ad every once in a while? That
Yeah.
seems like it'll be weird. So yeah, it's interesting to see, and I think what this is showing, all these news stories, are that we'll have a lot of these smaller kind of not as exciting things. I mean, we got like autocomplete in email writing in Gmail and Outlook last year or maybe 2 years ago. We'll see just a lot of these kinds of things being added to all sorts of software, it looks like.
And it's so hard to know what the killer features are going to turn out to be. Because, like OpenAI, quite famously, they launched ChatGPT as just another side project. Like they were just as shocked as anyone when it took over the internet. And so, maybe one of these things will be like the next big thing. And maybe it is, email writing automation or something like that. But we'll just have to wait and see in the next couple of months, I guess.
Yeah, we'll have to see. And then I guess moving on, something that's quite relevant to that thought. Our next story is inside Claude, the ChatGPT competitor that just raised over 1 billion. And we also have a story that Anthropic begins supplying its text generating AI models to select startup. So yeah, this is broadly speaking, this company Anthropic, which was started by many people from OpenAI, that is pretty focused on AI safety research, but has also developed this ChatGPT-esque Claude language model that seems to be quite good. There's been less kind of results on it or things I've seen, but it appears to be maybe on par. So yeah, this maybe is the main competitor right now to ChatGPT. What do you make of it, Jeremy?
I think there are a lot of interesting things about this. So for context, if you're following this space of AI companies that are playing in this area, so you've got OpenAI, and their motto seems to be move fast and break things. Publish like your models, test them out quickly. Anthropic was founded by a team, OpenAI. A lot of the members of OpenAI's AI safety team and their AI policy team that left over concerns partly about OpenAI's kind of monetization and kind of published by, not by default, but like, publish your AI model strategy. They felt that was a little bit risky. And so we see that concern about safety echoed in the strategy that Anthropic is using to build these models. The real big innovation here, the thing that makes Claude different from ChatGPT, is this new AI alignment strategy that they're using called constitutional AI. And it's actually kind of interesting. So roughly how it works is you have your AI model that's originally, kind of like, GPT-3, it'll write stuff that, could be hateful. It'll write stuff that could be very damaging or whatever. So you get it to generate a piece of output. And so, maybe you're like, hey, GPT-3 or hey, whatever model, tell me how to make a bomb. And then it'll like very helpfully tell you how to make a bomb. And then Anthropic has potentially a separate model with access to what's called a constitution, a set of rules that it's going to read. And then you're going to prompt that second model to say, hey, read these rules, read this constitution, and use them to critique the output that the first model put out. So if the first model actually said, oh yeah, no problem, here's how to build a bomb, the second model looks at the Constitution and says, well, wait a minute, this violates a constitutional principle around only generating kind of like safe outputs, for example. And then that second model is going to generate a corrected version of the response. So in this case, it might be like, sorry, I can't help you, making bombs is dangerous. And then you retrain the first model on that improved output, that corrected output from the second one. And so this is an all kind of AI loop. There's no human at any stage of this process, which is really exciting because this is scalable. And it seems to lead to a more, let's say, a less controversial model, one that doesn't generate the kinds of outputs that perhaps we've seen, ChatGPT come out with, at least in the early days. And so sort of interesting from that standpoint.
Yeah, this is quite interesting, I think, because you can compare it to ChatGPT, where there they have this reinforcement learning from human feedback to sort of try and correct what um, the model gets wrong. And this is in a way similar, right? Where you're getting feedback, but this time it's feedback from another model that can um, be trained kind of with human oversight, right? These lists of principles and constitutional AI come from humans, and that is trained on supervised learning and reinforcement learning. So this is, yeah, this is interesting, I think, because so far a lot of this, like for the last few years, a lot of the issues with large language models have been that they've trained in this paradigm of self-supervision. So they just train on a whole bunch of text, and they're good at predicting the likelihood of text continuations, autocomplete, but they have no notion of what's good, what's bad. They're just statistics, right? They're just outputting probabilities. And now it looks like to really commercialize, to use them, to make them more reliable, you do need this reinforcement learning phase of having trial and error and being able to basically explore and get things wrong and get things right in a training phase instead of in the deployment phase. And yeah, it's I think this year there was a fun meme where someone posted about how like this year in AI there will be like 1,000 papers on reinforcement learning from human feedback, which I think is very true, very likely to happen. So yeah, I think it's kind of exciting that just these models becoming this popular and this big will spur a lot of research into AI safety. And I think we'll have a lot of progress on how to get alignment with these sorts of techniques.
Yeah, and as the I feel like my role on the show is to be the kind of like AI safety freakout guy. But I gotta say, as the AI safety freakout guy here, this is the some of the best alignment news that I've seen. I think in the last year at least, where we're actually like, this is a scalable strategy. It's got a bunch of problems, and it only solves for this one narrow problem, of course, of like, how do you make sure that your system is being trained to optimize for a metric that is aligned with human values? There is a deeper version of the alignment problem called the inner alignment problem that actually doesn't get addressed by this. But this is a damn good start. Like, this is much better than nothing for sure. And as you say, it's just exciting to see some of the economic incentives starting to push towards at least a little bit more focus on the safety side, maybe preventing companies from launching these like unsafety padded models, which can otherwise, give all kinds of dangerous outputs in that. So yeah, very cool, very exciting, and nice to see Anthropic doing the good work on that front.
Yeah, Anthropic, I'm a big fan of their research. There's been a lot of cool insights. And another nice thing is they published a paper on this. So this was in December of last year. It's on arXiv. Anyone can find it. It's called Constitutional AI, Harmlessness from AI Feedback, and actually compares to RL from human feedback, to this idea they have of RL from AI feedback, where RL is reinforcement learning. So yeah, it's cool that they're publishing, and I could even see if they have this model, right, this constitutional AI model that can tell you if something is good or bad, right? You probably don't want to publish the weights of your language model because that's very expensive to train, and that's a competitive advantage. But you could publish the model that provides feedback so that other groups could fine
Interesting point.
tune their things. Yeah. So
Yeah.
yeah, very cool.
Okay, so that is really interesting. Something I actually hadn't thought about. Yeah, because people are often there's often this discourse in like AI safety about, can you split off capabilities from safety? Because people want to be able to do research on safety without also accelerating the capabilities that they think are so dangerous. And yeah, that's sort of an interesting way to split the problem up. I wonder if people are working on that.
Yep. And moving on, to more ChatGPT, and we're almost done, but some more. We got our lightning round. First up, OpenAI announces an API for ChatGPT, and it's whisper speech to text. So, it's been a while since ChatGPT has been out, but now there's an API for developers to use it. Using this GPT 3.5 Turbo. And, it seemed like nothing too exciting. We knew there was an API coming, but there was a small sort of, I don't know, freak out or a lot of excitement about this announcement because of the pricing, where the pricing is quite cheap. It's $0.002 per 1,000 tokens. So that's, I don't know, 1,000 tokens is maybe a page or two. That's very cheap compared. It's 10 times cheaper than existing models. There was a good tweet that basically said that you could process the entire Harry Potter book series, the mainline books, for like $4. So it's not that expensive to process a lot of text, and that means that we will see a ton of applications. It's very kind of approachable for even developers with not much money to develop prototypes and try out different things.
Yeah, it also raises a question about the extent to which generative AI is being commoditized. Because as you see these prices crashing, right? Like one way that you can think about this is, well, the total addressable market for generative AI has just dropped. And it's just dropped potentially, depending on how you do your math, by like a factor of 10. Now, in practice, this also means other people will be able to use it. But this is an aspect of that core question of how much profit is there in this business and for whom? Like, are model developers going to be able to sustain high margin with these sorts of developments? Now I can imagine Cohere, I can imagine AI 21 Labs, I can imagine all these other competitors to ChatGPT having to look at their pricing again and go like, wow, okay, we got to find a way to cut prices by a factor of 10 or we're out of this race. And anyway, interesting what this does to the ecosystem. And it doesn't seem like we're getting any answers just yet, but certainly an indication that price drops are going to be a recurring feature of this whole story.
Yeah, it's kind of impressive. We've seen this over and over in tech, where you have a new technology and then the prices keep going down with economies of scale and new developments. Here, it's almost like, that was a very quick process of new tech to it becoming cheap. Although, for the GPT-3 API has been out for a little bit and was more expensive. So I think this is, there has been work on this, and I'm sure having the Microsoft Azure cloud backing makes it possible to make this so efficient.
Yeah, and also interesting, I guess another couple interesting notes in the article too, one of which was that OpenAI is now allowing people to run their own instance of ChatGPT on OpenAI servers. So the kind of interesting, if you want to customize, if you're seeing a lot of volume, if you're a company and you're seeing a lot of volume for your ChatGPT chatbot, now you don't have to like share your instance of the chatbot with other people, and so you can have kind of a reserved instance of it, and that allows you to maybe get more reliable service. And so all kinds of like little optimizations behind the scenes happening at OpenAI, and not necessarily being super clear about where those cost savings are coming from. I think they said like by looking at their whole pipeline or something across the board, they got to 10x. So we don't actually know where those efficiency gains are coming from. But anyway, a whole bunch of new features as well, along with those efficiency gains.
Yeah, and just to mention, less exciting, but also sort of a big deal, is they announced this Whisper API, which is text transcription. So it's audio to text, and it's also quite cheap. This one is open source, but again, you can run it for cheap. So it's basically like the cloud, which we've seen a lot in software all over the place. So yeah, it's OpenAI full on business now, full on money printer. It looks like, which you have been working on for a while. Good for them, I guess. And related to that, Now there's another story on how Microsoft lets you change Bing's chatbot personality to be more entertaining. So now there's this toggle for tone thing where you have the ability to do a creative, balanced, or precise chatbot that is maybe a little less personified, maybe uses not quite as many emojis. And yeah, you can sort of tune it in this small way. And it's already rolled out to most users. So yeah, I got to play around with this Bing chatbot. I haven't gotten around to it yet.
Yeah, there's some, the parade of freaky things that the Bing chatbot is doing seems to get longer and longer. It's kind of a by the way thing, but it looks like they've now got a problem as well where, Bing chat would try to respond with something that, it's not supposed to respond to, like giving people medical advice or whatever. And it won't do it in the main kind of feedback that it gives, the main response. But then in the suggested responses that it offers to the user, it will now put in the thing that it wish it had said, if you will. So like there's all kinds of like weird stuff going on. And from an alignment standpoint, you look at that and you go, okay, like what the hell is going on here? But very interesting to see this attempt to kind of fine tune even more, like hone in, dial in that alignment strategy. So yeah, three different options here: creative, balance. So creative tone would be, I guess, a more out there chatbot that, just spitballs. You've got a precise option, which is for this more objective kind of tone neutral chatbot. And then a balanced option, which is apparently the default setting that people will use and enjoy with the new Bing chat. And I think one of the central kind of aspects of the story is just talking about how when Bing chat was first launched, we covered this a lot on the podcast, all kinds of weird things would happen. This thing would threaten people. It would give people instructions on how to do stuff that it shouldn't and all that. And so in response, Microsoft was like, oh my God, we've got to like just put in some hard constraints on what can happen here. And so we saw, Bing chat become very sort of neutral, refuse to respond to a lot of requests. We saw them cut down on the length of interaction. So for a while, you couldn't ask more than 5 or 6 questions in a row to the chatbot. And this is now, they're stepping back and kind of relaxing some of those constraints with this new update. And we'll see where it goes. But it really points to this fundamental trade-off between, how safe do you want your system to be versus how generally useful do you want it to be for any kind of task. Really interesting trade-off, and I thought really interesting article.
Yeah, this almost seems a little bit like, I don't know if nightmare scenario might be a little dramatic, but a scenario that some people have definitely considered where now there's a bit of an AI gold rush and there's all this competition for kind of a low-hanging fruit. And that means that from a capitalist perspective, there's a lot of motivation to push things out there and try to grab market share without being overly careful. And in many specific sectors, you might have people thinking ChatGPT should be a therapist, which
Right.
probably might not be a great idea. So I think we'll probably see more stories this year of things rolling out that are maybe a little bit broken and then being pulled back, and that'll be kind of a cycle.
Yeah, and it's funny, the political dimension of this. You mentioned capitalism, and that's absolutely something that at least I've been seeing on Twitter. Unfortunately, and I'm very pro-capitalist. I founded a YC startup. I've done the VC circuit. I think it's great, but there are market failures. There are things that the market fails to account for. Climate change. If that's your cup of tea, if you buy that as an example, hey, that's a great example. Another one is AI. Another one, we've got things like this for all kinds of child pornography or things like that. These are market failures. And if you buy the argument that AI poses a significant risk, then you know what? This race to build more and more powerful systems with fewer and fewer safeguards, which is part of what's happening here, it's a bit of a cause for concern. And it's funny to see people who I really respect their input so much in the startup world, and yet when it comes to this issue, it's like blinders. Like, we will not concede that there are market failures and that this could be one of them. But anyway, that's everyone has their opinion, and I'm just an idiot with mine. But it's sort of one of the through lines on Twitter in the last week that I was sort of a little concerned about.
Yeah, and we'll touch on later how, in terms of policy, regulators are going to get in here and try to maybe add some guardrails,
Yeah.
soon. But moving on, this is our last ChatGPT story for a while, so I guess that's exciting. And this one is kind of fun. It's about how this company DID out of Israel has released a new web app that gives a face and a voice to OpenAI's ChatGPT. So this is basically, chatbot, not ChatGPT. It's this Israeli startup has its own chatbot, and you can go there now and play around with it. It has a little kind of avatar that speaks and automates the speech, and I guess also creates audio. And I tried it out. It's not that exciting. It looks like a video game character kind of talking to you. It's a little bit uncanny, but they are saying that soon there will be a variety of avatars to choose from. You could also upload any images of your choice. And they do want to say that celebrities and public figures will not be allowed. And you could also generate characters like Dumbledore. So I guess so far this is not that big a deal, but once people start uploading photos and having these fictional characters you can talk to with animation, if nothing else, there will be a lot of YouTube videos with fun variants of this.
Yeah, and the uncanny valley aspect of this is so interesting because, like, for one, these sorts of avatars often there are challenges around like mouth movement, and you just like when you really focus on mouth, it's like it's a little weird, but it's also like one of those things that we don't know how many little hops or leaps are going to be required to get to photorealism with these sorts of avatars. And so, you can have the thing that's kind of like uncanny valley and it looks like a silly little toy. And like overnight, you cross some threshold and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of use cases get unlocked. And it's not clear where that threshold is. So I feel like this is actually one of those spaces that's underrated because it's easy to look at it and be like, that's a toy. But like a couple, more cheaper semiconductors and GPUs and a little bit more data and a little bit more tinkering, and you get to these systems that, could be pretty damn lifelike pretty soon.
Yeah, and I think a lot of this also comes down or will come down to how you implement it. It's not necessarily advancements, but this one, when I tried it, it's kind of weird because it's this avatar just floating in space. Kind of, it's just this face that is so obviously not a human, but you put like a Zoom background behind it, you put like a weird bedroom, and suddenly it'll be a lot more kind of realistic. We've all gotten used to Zoom, I guess, so it's not going to be that weird.
So that's kind of the thing that keeps coming up is people commenting on like, hey, people in AI, like, let's not forget user experience. Like you're not going to get big success by just like throwing a bunch of AI. So, I can generate a face or a thing that looks like a face. You have to go that extra mile and still ask, how are people going to use this? In some sense, the kind of product equation has not changed as fundamentally as we might want to imagine.
Yep. And last up in our business section, we have OpenAI rival Stable Diffusion. The maker of Stable Diffusion is seeking to raise funds at a $4 billion valuation. This is a leak, so this is not yet a new raising round. But this company Stability that released this model Stable Diffusion, which is text to image. So this is art generation, is seeking to raise money. They've already raised last round 100 million. That has a valuation of 1 billion. And now, with AI hype, not surprisingly, perhaps they're seeking to get even more money at a higher valuation.
Yeah, my thought always goes anytime I look at Stable Diffusion or OpenAI or Cohere, I always wonder about margins. Margins, folks. Are we going to get there? Are we going to be able to hit this $4 billion, like live up to that $4 billion price point? And like very likely so. I'm just flagging something like these valuations are getting to the point where these are not the valuations you associate with like a very high risk bet. Like as the valuation goes up, usually you want confidence in the margins and the scalability. So hopefully the investors are doing their due diligence on this one. I imagine they are, but kind of an interesting dimension to keep tracking.
Yeah, it's stability is definitely one of the front runners in the space, text to image, and there are a lot of applications where you could see this being useful. But then again, there are already a few other players, including OpenAI. It seems to be a little you can get away with smaller models, maybe even not quite as much training data. There's already open data sets for it. So yeah, I think this will be a more competitive space, and it'll be interesting to see if you can get much of a competitive advantage or a moat in this space as opposed to ChatGPT or something like it.
Or GPT-4.
Yeah, ChatGPT. Everyone, there's been all these stories on Twitter for months about what ChatGPT-4 will be, and so far it's just rumors that are pretty unsubstantiated. It's kind of funny. Moving on to research and advancements. First up, a story I'm quite excited about, which is kind of adjacent to ChatGPT, but also in a different space entirely. The story is Google's Palm E is a generalist robot brain that takes commands. So Palm is a language model that has already been published by Google last year. That is a very large language model, basically like GPT, not a chatbot, but a language model. And now they unveiled Palm E, which is Palm with embodiment and with a multimodal language model. So giant model, 560 billion parameters that now integrates vision and language at the same time and is used for decision making. So if you instruct it to bring me the rice chips from the drawer, one example, it can generate a sequence of actions, of high-level decisions of, walk to kitchen, pick up something, open something. And an interesting bit here, I think last week we discussed briefly RT1, the robot transformer that dealt with low-level control. This is doing high-level control, so it's deciding on these abstract commands of go to and pick up and so on. But the way it actually executes those commands is using this learned model RT1, which is also quite flexible. So yeah, this is showing, I think, and this is something we've already seen from last year, that these language models are being integrated with robotics at a pretty good clip. This is coming soon after a paper by Microsoft titled ChatGPT for Robotics. And yeah, it's kind of showing that it may not be quite as hard to do this high-level reasoning with a connection to the real world, with actual vision and understanding of what's around you, which is maybe a little bit surprising. And, from a robotics perspective, that's kind of a dream of a generalist robot that can reason for anything and figure out how to do anything, at least, as far as what humans could do, fairly straightforward things of like, go to the kitchen and make me a sandwich. And this is definitely showing that there's been quite a bit of progress towards that.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it does fall in line with a tradition of powerful kind of language model inspired robotic control schemes that goes back a really long way. But there were some early indications things were heading in this direction in 2021. I think there was Saycan, Everyday Robotics, and Google came out with this model. It's sort of similar in terms of capabilities. You could tell it like, oh, I spilled my Coke, can you help? And it would go and clean, figure out all the intermediate steps. And there are many intermediate steps. We just don't tend to think of them because they're so simple to us, involved in executing that kind of thing. And we've got DeepMind's Gato too kind of comes to mind here, right? Where we're doing very multimodal stuff with fundamentally one just giant ass model in the middle. And also brings up this kind of age-old question of what's it going to take to get to generally intelligent systems. One big argument historically has been you will need not just language, you're going to need what they call grounding, right? So you're going to need like to get this model to interact with the world, to see images, to see video, audio, kind of get it to connect the concepts, the ideas that it can learn through language modeling to grounded reality. And for people who are kind of in that train of thought, if that's your cup of tea, this is a pretty significant next move on the path to more general forms of intelligence.
Definitely. And I think another aspect here that's interesting in this paper, actually mentioning Gato, they trained it for this huge variety of tasks for 600 different things. That was, control in video games and image captioning and speech and just all these different domains. And actually, Gato, one of the things that people noted is it wasn't quite as good at any one of these things than when you train it from scratch to do just that task. And what was found in this paper is they had just 3 different variations of tasks that they were using on and had some fine-tuning data basically trained for these tasks. And they found that if you train a model on all 3 variants on planning and language table manipulation and some SECAN stuff, the combined data set resulted in the model being better at each one of those 3 things. And this is kind of good. It means that you can use a variety of tasks and situations and environments, and kind of throwing them all in together results in this overall better system that can benefit from a variety of data that's quite different. So that's an interesting result of this research as well.
Yeah, and I think it's got really interesting implications for the scaling argument. Just that, the scaling hypothesis says, obviously, the bigger you make these systems, the more general purpose they become. I remember when Gato came out the first time, people were pointing to exactly this thing that you just mentioned, this idea that, hey, yeah, maybe it can do like a bunch of different tasks, but it still performs less well than a system that's specifically trained for one of these tasks on the same kind of budget, if you will. What this seems to suggest is actually, if you keep growing the system, if you keep scaling it, you will actually get to a point where you get positive transfer between tasks. The skills that you learn by, learning to drive a car really well, all of a sudden you find, oh shit, I'm clever enough to pull out the salient lessons from that task and apply them to playing video games or something. And so that's sort of an interesting threshold and another kind of watershed moment, I think, in the history of AI scaling.
Yeah, exactly. I do think there's still questions where, in this case, one difference with Gato is they trained it you have different types of inputs and you have different types of outputs, right? Between different video games and different tasks like language captioning or, computer vision, the modalities of input and output are very different, even if you can make a single model. Here, it's all the same inputs, same outputs, which I think does kind of make it easier. Yeah. But at the same time, there was a paper last year on Socratic models where the idea was basically just make language the intermediate output, right? Yeah. Where it's just reasoning and then you can have specialist models. And maybe that's the path forward, where here, right, it's outputting language and then that language is being translated to motion by this RT1 model. And you could conceive of, instructions being translated to other domains with those other inputs by some other model. So it's interesting also in that sense. So this is definitely building on top of SECAN and Socratic models. Moving on to the next story, which is pretty interesting, pretty exciting, is what happens if you run a transformer model with an optical neural network. And I think, Jeremy, you took a more detailed look at this. So what did you get from this?
Well, I did, and this is a funny one just for me because in a previous life I worked in a what's called a quantum optics lab, basically a lab where you have mirrors, lenses, and lasers, and your life is miserable, and you're just doing all kinds of horrible work on grad student stipends to show quantum effects in light. And one of the guys that I met while I was doing that work at a 2-week long conference in Switzerland was the last author of this paper, Peter McMahon. He probably doesn't remember me, but hi, Peter, anyway. Okay, so this is actually kind of cool. So one of the big things when you're running a transformer on your standard kind of like semiconductor hardware is it's very expensive. It just costs a lot of processing power. Basically is expensive. It's energy expensive. And so one argument that they're exploring in this paper is like, hey, maybe we can actually create optical circuits, basically use light to mirror some of the computations that are happening in electric circuits on semiconductors to make a transformer circuit. And so as part of that, they use this really interesting tool that came out, the last like 5-10 years or so in optics. It's called a spatial light modulator. And you can imagine here a matrix of different, of like little squares that all have different reflectivities. Very roughly speaking, I'm skipping over some details here, but basically a matrix with a bunch of tiny squares. Each one reflects a different amount of light. So now you imagine you shine a beam at that matrix basically, and the light that comes out carries information that's encoded in the reflectivities there. So you get more light in one spot, less light in the other, and so on. And basically you've just encoded a matrix. And this allows you to do fancy things like the matrix multiplication operations that are present in transformer circuits. And so using this technique, they basically show that, hey, we think we can make optical circuits that run transformer algorithms for cheaper, and actually like potentially significantly cheaper. So they experimented with simulations, and they showed that if you scale it to blazes, you could get like around 10,000 times more energy efficiency out of these systems than current state-of-the-art digital electronic processors. So I thought that was kind of cool. I don't foresee this becoming a thing in the near future, but still kind of interesting that optical circuits, some tangential relevant to transformers at the very least.
Yeah, definitely. And this also in a previous life. Well, I didn't work on this in detail, but I did have a bit of work on neuromorphic circuits during an internship, which is kind of a similar idea in a way of, instead of having neural networks run on GPUs, where GPUs are these general purpose chips you can program to do lots of different stuff. You can use them for video games. You can use them for neural networks. Neuromorphic architectures seek to basically, have a more brain-like implementation, typically with spiking neural networks. And the outcome is similar in that it's much more energy efficient. And that's one of the major differences currently with neural networks is they're not nearly as energy efficient as our brains. So, and it's kind of interesting because so far, all the work has been done on these GPUs just because you can run any model on them. Yeah. And that's kind of been the pattern in AI is you train a new model for every new task with different data sets. But now with this in-context learning, with these massively self-supervised language models, first of all, because of their scale, and second of all, because they are useful for so many things just out of the box in a way, you could see, custom hardware being built just to run a particular trained model where once you bake in the weights, they're baked in, and maybe it's faster, maybe it's more energy efficient, but you don't have that flexibility of making it programmable for anything. And I am quite curious whether, we'll see that emerge in this coming decade as more and more stuff is driven by these large language models.
Yeah, no, it's also the homogenization of these models. Like over time, everything is, at least for now, everything seems like it's becoming a transformer. And so it's interesting, like that creates this economic incentive to go maybe, take advantage of some of the unique structural properties of transformers to get more efficiency. And, like NVIDIA's H100 does this, but like increasingly I expect we'll see a market for, that more tailored stuff, whether it's neuromorphic, optical, or some other kind of like integrated circuit design.
Yeah, exactly. And, it's early days. The scales of neural nets here aren't that big, and there's a lot of issues to work out in a way that's similar to the history of transistors, where they used to be gigantic back in the 50s and 60s. The CPUs were like less powerful than present day calculators. I'm curious to see if we'll see a similar pattern of these sorts of hardware techniques starting out as very impractical, very small, but as you improve on the tech, you can actually start, having billion parameter models, which, is interesting. If that's where we go, we have a new computation paradigm that's, we've been using the same paradigm more or less since the 40s, the von Neumann architecture. And here, this is analog computing. This is no longer using bits and bytes, right? So that is historically, I guess, if you're a nerd about technology, is very interesting.
Yeah. Also, potential for displacing your sort of established industry players, right? Like anytime you have a new technology like this, people talk about quantum computing in the same vein, but like the people who have historically, the companies and even the countries that have historically led the way on certain kinds of processors might all of a sudden find, oh shit, like there's a new wind blowing, and it may be coming from another set of actors.
Yeah. And speaking of that, in our lightning round, the first story is scientists now want to create AI using real human brain cells. And this is on a new paper that is more of a position paper, no real results. And they are trying to coin this term organoid intelligence, which is biocomputing and intelligence in a dish, where you basically want to grow a little biological computer that is using bioengineering advances to be able to develop these brain organoids, which are, I guess, kind of like chips, kind of like transistors in a way. And that's another possible avenue forward, where maybe you could, bake in something like ChatGPT or something like that in biological hardware, which, as we know, is much more efficient and dense in terms of what it can do. This is even more early on, and I think is probably less promising, just because, I don't know, growing brains does seem pretty far out. But that's just showing, I think, there'll be a lot more investing in these new computing paradigms.
Yeah, and more exploration too of the mapping between the human brain and AI systems. Like it's an interesting debate that we have perennially in this field, where people will say, "Oh, well, your artificial neurons, these very simple mathematical structures, they don't capture the full depth and complexity of what happens in a real neuron." And this, I don't know, this might give us a little bit of a lens on that too. Can you get simple neural circuits with real biological neurons to do things that are more complex than the same number of, say, artificial neurons set up in the same way? I don't know if that's going to be feasible in the near term, but it's kind of an interesting, almost philosophical question that comes to mind with this stuff.
Definitely. And I think from an AI researcher perspective, it's like, well, if we have these biological neural nets, will we be able to train them? Can we?
Can I do my back propagation?
I know. I guess humans learn somehow. So
that's true.
Yeah. Next story, we have Google is one step closer to building its 1,000 language AI model. So this is about a new paper titled Google's USM, scaling automatic speech recognition beyond 100 languages. So this is speech recognition. You have audio, and you want to figure out the text of that. And they announced that they want to be able to support the world's 1,000 most spoken languages. And this is a paper that's showing progress towards that. with a model that supports over 100 languages, which is big, of course, and has a lot of data. This historically has been a harder area to make progress in because having annotated audio with text is needed. You can't really do self-supervision in a way that language models do. But yeah, okay, we are now making some real progress.
Yeah, and it ties into language modeling, I guess, in an interesting way. I remember Jan, like I just pulled it up. So this is the head of the AI alignment team at OpenAI. So he tweeted this out like earlier this month. Last month, February 13th, 2023. He said, with the Instruct GPT paper, we found that our models generalized to follow instructions in non-English, even though we almost exclusively trained on English. We still don't know why. I wish someone would figure this out. And so there's this. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's interesting. It reminds me, I vaguely remember in some previous work where I guess speech patterns, I remember seeing this where if you train on a lot of English and you train on a little bit of Spanish, learning to speak in English seems to translate to making it easier to learn other languages. So that's quite related.
Yeah, and it's all part of this debate over that people always have about, well, your model might be good at generating text, at predicting the next word, but does it really understand, right? And people who say, well, it's really just a statistical inference model, right? And like as if the brain is anything different, let's say. But in this context, it's sort of this interesting mystery for people who take that view. Like, how do you then explain this? You may be able to. I'm sure there are interesting explanations, but this at least was being pointed at by, in this case, Jan Leica at OpenAI, that, hey, this seems like a genuine mystery. Another one of those weird blessings of scale. You just scale up these models and they just seem to figure out how to do shit. And we don't really know how, but yeah, many mysteries still left, even though we're getting on for 3 years in the AI scaling game.
Yeah. Even you could argue a decade in scaling.
Right.
Where this is now. There was a paper on scaling that argued that there was like actually 2 phases, where like the 2010s was a period of scaling, and now in the last few years we entered a new area of scaling that's like even faster. So yeah. Next up, we have AI masters video games 6,000 times faster by reading the instructions. This is about the paper Read and Reap the Rewards, learning to play Atari with the help of instruction manuals. AI does like these pithy paper titles, which is fun. And yeah, like the title says, the idea here is that instead of learning from scratch with trial and error, which is the typical paradigm for reinforcement learning, you start out knowing nothing about the task and you just try different things until you figure out what works and what doesn't. Here, the idea is, well, for games, for a lot of stuff, you have instruction manuals that explain the rules of the game and the goals of the game. So there is, a slightly fancy approach to be able to translate the text of an instruction manual to the visual language of the game and the actions you can do. And perhaps unsurprisingly, if you read the instruction manual, you can learn much faster. And I was quite excited at seeing this because it's such a common sense idea of like, don't start assuming you know nothing. You can actually be told what the task is and do it. And there's been other work on this throughout the years, but I think as a paradigm for reinforcement learning, this is hopefully going to become more of a norm.
Well, and I think this is a little bit of an I told you so moment for you, Andre, because as I recall, you've raised this on a couple of occasions, just this idea that, hey, like this is a direction that probably would be fruitful to explore. So it's kind of cool to see it materialize like this. And well, good on you for not being too rub your face in it about it. That's a really interesting result, and the power of priors, right? Like, how many times do we try throwing our models at something from scratch? Treat it as like a narrow problem in that sense, and train just for that one task, and we find we don't get as good performance as a model that has a little bit, kind of a bit of a leg up, whether through pre-training on a bunch of different tasks or whether through kind of direct instruction. This kind of seems like it's along that continuum, like a bit of pre-training in a sense before the main task is attempted.
Yeah, in a sense. There's some caveats here where the games they did were pretty simple. But still, you can imagine this being generalizable, where if you have instructions, now you can connect those instructions to a visual semi-embodied world. And you could even argue this is related to that paper on robotics we had, where you say in text what you want and you get that in practice instead of just learning from scratch. And last up in this section, we have artificial intelligence from a psychologist point of view. And I think, Jeremy, you can tell us more about this.
Yeah, well, I thought this was kind of a bit of a cute paper. It uses GPT-3, so a little bit out of date. There's really one main thing that we're trying to get at here, and that's like looking at the failure modes of AI systems and comparing them to the failure modes of human cognition. So is it the case that, for example, a language model like GPT-3 will make some of the same mistakes that human beings would make on a psychological test? And the example that really jumped out at me here was something called the Linda test. And so this is where you have test subjects and they're introduced to a fictional young woman named Linda as a person who they're told is deeply concerned with social justice and opposes nuclear power. Based on that information, those two pieces of information, so Linda is really concerned about social justice and she opposes nuclear power, the subjects are asked to decide between two statements. One, is Linda a bank teller? Or two, is she a bank teller and at the same time active in the feminist movement? Now, the thing is, if you're familiar with probability or have any intuition about this, you might know that no matter what the context is, the odds that someone is going to be a bank teller is always going to be higher than the odds that they're going to be a bank teller and that another thing is going to be true, no matter how likely that second thing. Because the probability for that second thing is going to be a number between 0 and 1. And so that can only make the overall probability lower. And so what was interesting here is that GPT-3 makes the same mistake here that a lot of humans might. It says, just based on this background that she's against nuclear power and cares about social justice, I'm going to bet that not only is she a bank teller, but also she is active in the feminist movement. So sort of interesting. It's the intuitive answer that comes to mind to all of us before we really start to think about it. Interesting to see it reflected in GPT-3 at this scale and stage. And curious to see, is this something that persists with more and more powerful models? Andre, I'm sure you've heard of this, but the inverse scaling prize, this is something that AI safety people have been on about. And it's this question of can we find tasks that AI systems perform worse on at larger scales? And this seems like it could potentially be an interesting candidate, right? Like the kinds of mistakes that human beings make, the better our AI systems get, the more scaled they get, maybe the better they replicate the mistakes of the human beings whose data they're trained on. So interesting question, but just thought I'd flag because it seemed like a fun one.
Yeah, it's kind of fun. And there's, this test has been around for 40 years. So there is a rich history of research. Things like if you word the question differently, you might get different results. I have seen a kind of interesting point that Gary Marcus has made on this sort of test, where he argued that, if you're using GPT-3, it probably knows about this test, right? So is it just saying what it has seen, or is it actually responding from scratch? And that's kind of a fun question.
Yeah, the all-important safety question of what does your AI model actually believe about the world, as distinct from what will it tell you it believes?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Moving on to policy and societal impacts stories. First up, we have OpenAI is now everything it promised not to be: corporate, closed source and for profit. As many have possibly seen, it's been a little bit of a joke for a while that OpenAI is not open now. They have stopped publishing models, code, even papers. More recently, there's no paper on ChatGPT. And they did change from being a nonprofit to being this kind of strange combination of a limited for-profit something. And yeah, now is probably a good time to reflect on how OpenAI has evolved. What are your thoughts, Jeremy?
Yeah, well, I thought this was an interesting article because it really reflects the fact that there are two parallel universes in interpreting what OpenAI is all about and the reasoning behind what they're doing. There's kind of like a cynical take and there's a charitable take. And I think there's an interesting argument about whether the truth lies somewhere in the middle here. The sort of cynical take, which is adopted by this journalist who is writing this post, not the first journalist to rip on OpenAI. The cynical take here is like, look, you launched, in 2015 or whatever it was, to the world. You sold this very optimistic message. You told the world you'd be open and publish all your stuff because you were worried about concentration of power. That was like the key thing that you wanted to avoid, and that's why the name is OpenAI. But now all of a sudden we're seeing you, close up, become a capped for profit. They often emphasize the for-profit part. They don't emphasize the capped part, which in the more charitable interpretation is actually a really important part of the story. But in any case, they go on from there and they say, hey, like you basically sold out and now you're pumping out these models. Elon Musk is famously now on this side of the equation saying, look, you're just totally for-profit, pumping out models at scale or whatever with profit in mind. I think the more charitable take, which again, I think has an important component of truth here, is if you're OpenAI, you launch in 2015, your mission is to make AI openly available to the world, avoid concentration of power, and avoid the catastrophic risks that come with AI. Now, those three things cannot coexist. And over the course of the next few years, you gradually start to learn that. You start to realize, hey, we can't have arbitrarily powerful AI systems just released to the world in the way that we might otherwise want to if these systems are intrinsically dangerous or if they can power malicious applications. That's kind of one ingredient. Then, worse still for you, you discover, oh shit, AI scaling with GPT, let's say GPT-2 actually, maybe the first instance of that, but really GPT-3, AI scaling seems to be a real thing. It seems like we now know what it's going to take to push capabilities much further, and it's going to cost a lot of money. And so now we have to kind of look at our nonprofit status and say, is this really sustainable? We need to find a way to get money in the door. And so they adopt this capped for profit structure where they say, yes, we have to be profitable because we've got to be able to raise money from investors to fuel the scaling that otherwise is totally unsustainable. Let's at least cap the profits that our investors can make at 100-fold. So Microsoft invests billions of dollars. They can only ever get a 100x return. All the rest essentially gets funneled to the OpenAI nonprofit and for presumably redistribution down the road. And so you can kind of see like OpenAI trying to walk this awkward tightrope. You can have a little bit of sympathy for them at least as they go through that process. But on the other hand, it's also true that, there has been a reversal on a lot of these public positions. They talk about it a lot in their recent post, preparing for AGI or something. Preparing for AGI and beyond or something like that. Anyway, that was my 2 cents. I think there are two parallel worlds there. I think there's some truth to both. They're both interesting to think about.
Yeah, I would say I agree where it's interesting timing looking historically where they switched this nonprofit to this capped profit model in 2019. And this pretty much happened before, like as they were making this shift to mainly working on GPT type stuff and scaling
Yeah.
things up, right? They released GPT in 2018, they released GPT-2 in 2019, and GPT-2 at the time was quite big at a few billion parameters, right? And then they changed their status, and they got this $1 billion investment from Microsoft. And I think, yeah, if you're thinking about, hypotheticals, I don't think we'd have ChatGPT without them having
Yeah.
changed to a capped profit model. And I think there are some arguments, in both directions where, being closed on the one hand is not great because now you have a lot of more concentration on, basically you are able to dictate what people do, and maybe you can misuse the AI. But on the other hand, I will say that I've found that OpenAI has been pretty careful in making sure the models are not misused. So with DALL-E, for instance, right, they didn't release the model. And if you try and use DALL-E via their API or via the website, they do prohibit you from making, deepfakes and porn, for instance. And similarly with ChatGPT, right, it's built in with guardrails against, racist speech or misinformation, intentional misinformation. So part of the initial vision is definitely there, where the goal is to guide development of AI in a direction that is broadly beneficial to humanity, even if it's no longer quite as open to kind of the larger sense of humanity being able to guide it. So I'm quite sympathetic to OpenAI. I think there is a good argument to be made that while it might be a cynical perspective that they decided to just switch from nonprofit to profit, from an AI safety perspective, there has been this camp that said, let's develop the models ourselves so we can guide them in a good direction. And that really seems to me what they're doing.
Yeah, and that take in the safety community is controversial too. Like we we can certainly say that, but I think from where these intentions come from, like I don't think Sam Altman is sitting there in his evil lair thinking about how can I close off access to these models and make a ton of profit. I think OpenAI is consistently invested, and Sam A actually personally is consistently invested in a bunch of projects aimed at sharing the wealth and figuring out how to do that properly. But it's a tricky tightrope. I mean, I don't really particularly begrudge anybody their opinions on this, and OpenAI's publication strategy and the fact that they've been so open and they've created so much hype around these models is highly controversial in the AI alignment community itself for accelerating AI progress in a context where we don't know how to make these systems safe. And so, there's so much to dig into, and maybe at some point we'll do a longer discussion about it. But I think we got a lightning round. Oh, sorry,
Yes.
no, we got one more news.
One more main story, and then we got a lightning round. So moving on, the next story is, as AI booms, lawmakers struggle to understand the technology. So obviously now everyone knows about ChatGPT. Everyone knows that this is a big deal, and maybe unsurprisingly, now there's a rush for lawmakers, policymakers to understand what to make of it and how they can impact, or what should they do in this sense.
Yeah. Everyone listening here will be shocked, I'm sure, absolutely shocked to learn that politicians do not totally understand what AI is. And this was an article, that referenced a couple of lawmakers who were sort of frustrated. They're going around, they're trying to tell their colleagues in Congress, hey, bad shit is happening. We need to regulate this space now. And the biggest blocker they're running into is exactly that. These are the people who famously asked Mark Zuckerberg how he makes money, and didn't quite understand the answer. And so this sort of thing, but applied to AI, does cause problems when there's a lot of technical nuance in this space. But they talk about this idea of companies being kind of locked right now in a race to the bottom on safety. It's the thing that seems to be sacrificed as everybody rushes to get, Bing chat out the door or whatever else. And one of the things that I found maybe a little disappointing in this article was that they really kind of blurred the lines between different kinds of concern. They kind of like mixed them together. They talked about ethics in the same sentence as they talked about like physical safety from AI systems and malicious use and catastrophic risk and all this stuff. So it made it a little bit difficult. If I'm imagining myself as like a policymaker trying to understand this whole space, like how do you tease apart these issues? And if you just like kind of group them together, I don't know. That was just my personal take. I thought the article on the whole was still an interesting little expose.
Yeah, I think it's a good kind of thing to reflect on. Obviously, companies don't have much incentive helping out the government to regulate them. But this also reminds me that this is where academia can play a good part, where, for instance, at Stanford, has been the Human AI Institute, HAI, for a few years now, and that's meant to be an interdisciplinary group where you can have, policymakers, lawyers, people from different fields, even philosophy, collaborate on really researching AI in a broader context beyond just the technical details. And they have even published policy briefs. So this is the sort of thing where I think maybe similar to other areas of technology, it's not going to be the companies driving the discussion around regulation. Is going to be groups that are not financially incentivized and can break it down technically.
Yeah, that's so true. I mean, it makes you look at the ecosystem right now and wonder, like, okay, are the players at the table all the players that we need at the table? And right now, I'm guessing the answer is very much no. So yeah, hopefully academia can step in.
Yep. And now we can go to lightning round. And first up is pretty much a follow-up to that prior story with how ChatGPT broke the EU plan to regulate AI. And the broke might be a little bit dramatic, but it definitely has impacted it. So we've mentioned it a couple of times. Europe has been working on the AI Act, which is really a very ambitious effort to introduce regulations and basically categorize risks of different AI systems and then have developers and companies be liable for, releasing things that don't have safety constraints, for instance, don't have transparency and human oversight. It doesn't look like there's much kind of consideration for things like ChatGPT in the AI Act. So there's some effort to address it, and there's some argument as to whether, in this kind of very broad technology of a chatbot, should this be classified as a high risk thing where you are required to be transparent and have human oversight, or maybe it's too general a technology to be able to categorize it as one thing or another.
Yeah, and it's one of the properties of these systems as well that, you can build a really powerful AI system with a specific use case in mind. But if it's a generative model or a general purpose AI system like, ChatGPT or GPT-3, it will have a whole bunch of capabilities other than those you think it has, other than those you have in mind. And so you might be making like a perfectly, innocent psychotherapy chatbot, and then you learn, oh, wait, shit, this actually has the ability to manipulate people. It has the ability to, plant ideas in people's heads. And so, yeah, really not clear what high risk ought to mean. But it certainly seems like it should capture the potential uses of these systems and not their intended uses. And I think that's one distinction that's really hard to get around because, uranium isotopes are useful for many different things. And, if they were just useful for nuclear power, hey, maybe it would make sense to say that they're not high risk, but they could potentially be used for other things that are less tasteful. And in the same way, we buckle down on our uranium. Maybe the same ought to be said for very powerful AI systems of the sort that we're building now and in the future.
Yeah, I think that's where it might not be that far from what the act is, where it is focused on uses of AI. So it's, for
Yeah.
instance, facial recognition for policing. And in that sense, I think, if you're using ChatGPT to make a therapist, that's pretty easy to classify as high risk. So it might not be that big a jump, but it is kind of tricky to say, well, this is kind of a base technology that a lot of things build on top of. Does this base technology already need to incorporate safety, or is it the downstream players that need to think about it more? But yeah, legal stuff is very much also catching up. Another story we have here is about how the UK Supreme Court hears a landmark case about a patent case over AI inventions. And we've already discussed this, I think, last year, where Stephen Fowler has tried to do this in the US, where he argued that an AI he developed should be granted patents. Here, the same outcome. The Supreme Court ruled that you cannot list an AI as the inventor of something. Still a bit of a maybe not that big a deal for now, but now with ChatGPT, maybe you could argue that at least it's collaborative in some sense, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It reminds me of outing myself as a nerd here. It reminds me of an episode of Star Trek: The Next Generation, in which there's a debate over whether or not Data, who's the android on the ship, should have like rights as a person. And all this stuff sounded nice and science fiction-y back in the 1990s, but today, oh boy, it kind of makes you wonder, and it brings all these other questions in about AI sentience and things like this. Like, we're not that far from being forced to contend with these questions. But the legal one is interesting too, because presumably, if you set that precedent, especially in the UK legal system, which is very, very precedent oriented, if you set that precedent that today's AIs are not going to be considered as possible inventors of patents, like presumably that's going to have an impact on your future rulings as these systems get better. And so kind of makes you wonder, like, what kind of anticipatory thinking is going on here? Like, are they thinking about, okay, maybe not this system, but what about the systems of 2025 and on? And so anyway, sort of interesting to think about the future in that sense.
Definitely. Moving away from legal stuff and policy stuff, we have a couple stories on societal impacts. First up, we have how a couple in Canada were reportedly scammed out of $21,000 after getting a call from an AI-generated voice pretending to be their son. So pretty much what it says, there was someone who claimed to be a lawyer who said their son was in jail for killing a diplomat. And there was, I guess, there was this fake voice of their son. And yeah, they got scammed. And this is something we've seen already in a couple of cases of, there was, I think, also a scam on a bank previously. And now with 11 Labs, making it easy to clone anyone's voice with just a bit of data, we'll see a lot of this. I think this is just a gold mine for phishing and for scammers. So already we see an example just a month after 11 Labs kind of became big. Concerning.
Yeah, and the speed at which these techniques are evolving too. It used to be, you'd go into your grandparents' place and they'd have someone on the phone and they'd just not be quite sure, and they'd be like, "Hey, Andre, can you tell me, is this suspicious to you or something?" Or they'd show you an email, and the same thing would play out, and you'd kind of go like, "Okay, boomer, let me just fix this problem for you right now," and you'd explain to them how it all works. But with the rate at which this stuff is evolving, basically, unless you're tracking the cutting edge of AI all the time, there are going to be these new threat vectors, these new phishing attacks, these new malware schemes, whatever, that are going to take you by surprise. And all of a sudden, it's not going to be good enough to just be like a Zoomer or a millennial or whatever. You're going to have to actively put in effort to understand what the landscape of capabilities is. And there is no better way to do that, ladies and gentlemen, than to subscribe, like, share, and comment on the Last Week in AF. Sorry, no, anyway.
Yeah. You know, being informed is good.
Yeah, you gotta be.
But this also reminds me, you know, possibly like many people, I've had some experiences with scammers, and not to generalize, but in some cases it wasn't too hard to figure out.
Yeah.
It was like someone not from the US with a pretty heavy accent. Now these operations running from outside the US, where they want you to send them Bitcoin, can be a lot more a lot better at fooling people. So yeah, definitely concerning. And speaking of filters, the last story here is how TikTok's trendy beauty filter ushers in new tech and new problems. So now there's this filter called Bald Glamour, which has now been downloaded more than 16 million times since its release. And, you know, there's been other filters for improving your appearance and your face, but this one is pretty striking because it really changes quite a bit your appearance. And it's been downloaded a lot. It I think is adding to the problem we've seen a lot of on Instagram and elsewhere of just pushing for these unrealistic standards and pushing for, you know, the notion that you have to be beautiful, right? And this false reality that Instagram and now TikTok are conveying of, you know, this is how people look. They look glamorous or things like this. And again, kind of concerning.
Yeah, like to me, this one is like an entire philosophical social debate in a beautiful, tightly focused nutshell that nobody can really ignore. How much of you do you want to preserve when AI can change what you appear to be? Like, this is an important question. It's not something you can glance over, right? We wear makeup, we make small changes to ourselves, and that's okay. But there's like a continuum there, a slippery slope, and at some point, presumably, we decide, okay, that's no longer who I am. And like how far do we want that to go? And here we're kind of being confronted with that. And the weird thing is that, you know, maybe 16 million people feel the answer is we take this as far as it goes. You know, what if this changes your skin tone completely? What if it changes your whole face so you're unrecognizable? In a sense, what have you even achieved there? Like, it's to me, it's, I don't know, it just seems like such a fascinating question about what humanity is going to want to turn into once basically anything is possible. There's almost this like weird transhumanist dimension to it in a way, and it's yet just focused on this such an innocent seeming, or at least a kind of an innocuous seeming like tech product here.
Yeah, this is getting into some pretty deep territory of also with respect to online in general, like what is the boundary between a character you're playing and yourself, right?
Right.
There's like terms like hyper reality and all this discussion around that. Pretty interesting question, and stuff like this, we'll just keep adding to it. But moving on to some art and some fun stuff, not all fun stuff. We got a few more stories to round things out, starting with AI-generated fiction is flooding literary magazines, but not fooling anyone. This is following up on a recent story on how a renowned magazine, Clarkesworld, which is focused on science fiction, closed submissions due to being flooded with AI submissions. There's a chart showing, you know, in February, they got like 1,000 submissions. It's almost 1,000-fold increase or 100-fold increase. And this is pretty much spammy. It's just people trying to make a buck for the most part. And now there's been other publications that have gotten the same problem. And these are used to be open to anyone to submit to. These are kind of avenues for people starting out who haven't been published in any real way to publish short stories. So this is, kind of concerning, where it's another case of if you have people who want to make a quick buck or don't really take this stuff that seriously. Now, if you are someone who is trying to write something serious, these avenues are being kind of made more difficult to take part in.
Yeah, and to stretch the discussion that we had just a minute ago on kind of remasking yourself visually, how about thinking of this as another kind of mask that you can wear as an author? You're not actually showing your true face, your true self, your true writing. You're just like putting out a bunch of ChatGPT text and calling it your own. And at what point do we start to say, okay, well, we don't want to be reading content that is like that? Or, I mean, obviously we're going to end up doing it, but anyways, I think it's another interesting dimension of that, and just so scary as a time for people in the publishing business right now. I mean, I've got some friends who are doing different things in that space. I've got a book coming out soon, actually. I hasten to mention. Almost forgot about that. But anyway, and you just like look at all the people who work in the space, the copywriters, the copy editors, the people who do marketing, like all these people across the spectrum, and what their jobs are going to look like, not just because they'll get automated, but because they'll get flooded with like this kind of product. I don't know. I mean, we're going to need to rethink the whole architecture of this space, I suspect, just to handle that volume.
Yeah, I agree. I think I'm not quite as concerned because effectively this is spam, right? And we have had spam filters. This is harder to detect, but it's possible. This article noted that, they could basically reproduce some of these entries where there were 20 short stories titled The Last Hope. And if you ask ChatGPT to write a short science fiction story and then copy paste the instructions to this magazine, it generates things like The Last Echo or The Last Message or things like that. So I feel like, and also this is a new, like ghostwriting has existed. There are services where you can pay people to write things, really pay them very little, and then publish it and try to make a quick buck. And that's been going on for years. So this is really just making it easier. And hopefully it'll not be, it'll be harder for these platforms, but I think you could probably automate detection of a lot of this.
Yeah, I maybe the reason for my pessimism is scaling. Like, I just see this as like right now, these are relatively easy to detect. It's still more of a pain in the ass because you've got this extra due diligence step. But, even today, like detection mechanisms are pretty shaky. And I would expect generation to beat discrimination in the long run as these language models get more and more human-like. So, it's more like this is a bit of a harbinger of what's to come. And I don't expect the problem to get any easier to deal with. I'll put it that way.
Yeah, I agree. I think maybe it's hopefully, right, it's going to be a case of if you're generating garbage, generic nonsense, even if you get past it, people won't care or won't look at it. But we'll see. And next up, quite related to that, another story is ChatGPT launches Boom and AI written ebooks on Amazon. So there's an example here where someone wrote a 30-page illustrated children's book in a matter of hours. And now there were over 200 ebooks in the Kindle store listed with ChatGPT as a co-author. With things like the power of homework. And yeah, this is again a case of people wanting to just make a quick buck and, spamming effectively.
Well, and it's all these, because this was in at least one of these articles where they were talking about how it's all these get rich quick YouTubers who are like, hey, like, let me show you how to make the fastest, the same people who are telling you to do like drop shipping on Amazon or whatever to make money. And now this is just like the new thing. And like, thank you for adding friction to society, guys. Like, this is really wonderful. But yeah, I mean, to your point, it's right now they're low quality. At a certain point when they become high quality, the flip side is like, hey, we just get really good AI generated content. So maybe that's just intrinsically good. But it does make you wonder, like, how is the publishing business going to change in light of this? Like, are books even going to be a thing? I mean, I don't know. Kind of interesting to think about where this all goes.
Definitely, yeah. But moving on to some more positive stories to round things out, we have the first story is Hollywood 2.0, how the rise of AI tools like Runway are changing filmmaking. This is not a super in-depth story, but I did find it quite interesting to find out that the movie Everything Everywhere All at Once, which I think many people maybe are aware of, it's been winning tons of awards. And it's a very visual effect heavy movie that had a pretty low budget and only like 6 people. So it goes into how in doing the movie, the visual effect artist used this tool Runway, which is a company that produces AI powered video editing software, and not just editing, but also various things like masking and things like that. And I found it quite interesting that now this major movie that might win an Oscar was partially made using this Runway tool.
Yeah, and the effect that might have. I mean, you think about what YouTube did to kind of the democratization of content creation and hosting. Like, I wonder what other indie movies that start to look like they're blockbuster budget movies. What might that look like, and the opportunities for like artistic expression and all that stuff. Really kind of exciting time to be a movie fan.
Yeah, I think it's a lot of this. I think isn't necessarily going to enable things we haven't done before. We've had visual effects for a while. Marvel is just mostly computer generated Marvel movies, but now it's going to be more affordable and easier to do things like that, which is exciting.
Yeah.
And final story, we're going to loop back to something we touched on a few weeks ago. The AI-powered Seinfeld spoof is set to return to Twitch with new guards rails in place, and I think it might already be back. So again, kind of a funny story where there is this never-ending Seinfeld spoof of Seinfeld doing kind of stand-up that initially went wrong. It made, I believe, racist or transphobic jokes. And that was interesting. I think in this article, it goes into the company's reaction and how they thought there were moderation going on in OpenAI's API, and that was not the case. And now they are relaunching this with much more of a careful approach of making sure that there is moderation, where they're working with OpenAI to moderate and also with their own team.
And thank goodness that this Seinfeld AI-powered Seinfeld thing is back online, because the internet needs that, I will say. No, I mean it's just really interesting to see the also the question there as between who owns the responsibility. Like if they thought that OpenAI was doing this screening and then they weren't, and as a result, like they incur brand damage on their project. It's like, well, who do you blame? Like, was that your fault for not checking in? Was it OpenAI's fault for not being clear about what was happening in the back end? Like all kinds of interesting questions anytime AI starts to do a lot of our thinking for us. And the positive thing is that we now have Seinfeld back on the airwaves. So very, very pleased about that.
Yes. Now that it's back, I think I'll actually check it out. I'm curious to see what this thing is. And, it's 24/7, so you could go to Twitch and find it, I assume. Well, with that, we are done with this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. As usual, as we mentioned, you can find our text newsletter at lastweekin.ai, which has many more articles. And if you like a podcast, we'd really appreciate it if you share it, and especially if you could give it a rating and a review on something like Apple Podcasts. I actually do read them. There was a recent one that mentioned that AI assisted editing that I did was actually annoying. It was like clipping things, so I reverted to doing manual editing, having tried that, which was kind of funny. So yeah, if you have suggestions or if you just want to let us know that you appreciate the podcast, we would appreciate that. But if you don't have a time for that, we do appreciate everyone listening, and we hope you will keep tuning in as we keep covering the news.